So these are going to be the best decks after the expansion, as well as the Warlock nerf to the Warlock Snake, and this isn't going to be in any particular tiered order. It's too early to really know what deck is specifically better than others. This is just around the board, all these decks are really good. First, we have OTK Cleave Hunter. The idea behind this deck is simple. You want to pump up your cleave cards like the Gargon and the Hollow Hound with things like the Bestial Madness as well as the Messenger Buzzard. Then, you want to give either one of your cleave minions always bigger, so that way excess damage goes face, and if you're able to hit 3 small minions, you can easily do 20 or more damage in a single turn, which is absolutely insane. It's a very aggressive deck, it's kind of new. Next is going to be, oh my goodness, I hate this deck so much, the OTK Demon Hunter deck with the Blind Eye Sharpshooter. This deck I played not too long ago, and I think I went 9-1. Overall, if you can draw the Blind Eye Sharpshooter, which you mulligan for every single game, if you can find it by around turn 6, you pretty much just win the game. The opponent can't really deal with the board that you put out all of a sudden, and you can do a lot of damage face. I will admit, the Cleave Hunter deck actually does kind of punish you for summoning a lot of small minions, so it is kind of a counter pick to this, but overall, most other classes just can't really deal with it, at least right now. It's a very good deck. It requires literally no legendaries, so if you are on a budget, it's a pretty good deck, but also know that the Sharpshooter will probably be nerfed sooner rather than later, so keep that in mind. Next, we have Control Priest with the Highlander. This deck is probably the most hit or miss deck on this list, mostly because of the fact that I personally had a good experience playing it, but it was a fairly small sample size and I do see some weaknesses. For example, yes, you have Reno for 1 extra board wipe and Elise for an extra win condition, but since you're only able to run single copies of all of these cards, you don't have 2 copies of something like Whirlpool to potentially deal with an opponent or something like that. Overall, the deck was really fun. You play Elise to summon copies of your biggest minions, Rivendare, the Titan, the Colossal Minion, as well as Yogg-Saron. Sometimes you'll summon ETC and you'll get unlucky, but the value you can get out of Elise is insane. And then in your band, you run a couple of extra minions because you don't want Elise to summon those minions. So you don't want to run Theotar and Sister Svolna in your deck because Elise will summon it. You want to put it in your band so that way your Elise is more consistent and they're still like in your deck. Oh yeah, overall the deck has really good control. It's got some cool win conditions, but again, it's the most like hit or miss deck on this list. Next, we're gonna have Plague Demon Hunter. Now this deck is mostly as a counter pick if you're playing against a lot of Highlander decks or decks that just happen to draw a lot. For example, Rainbow Mage draws a lot of things and draws a lot of spells. If they draw spells, they will draw Plague sometimes, and you could potentially slow them down and do a bunch of damage. This deck is pretty much entirely determined on what the meta ends up being though. So craft this deck with a little bit of caution. I personally love it. It's my most played deck from last expansion, and I'm already loving it this expansion. Being able to get your excavate cards to resummon, you get the Azurite Rat. You're able to resummon Reska. You're able to take some cool win conditions from your opponent, which is just like an extra thing for you. Overall, I actually really like this deck. I personally think it's the most fun, but again, it is more of a counter pick if the meta has a lot of Highlander decks in it because Reno is really, really good. It is a pretty decent deck on its own, but it does lose to aggro. Next, we have Elemental Shaman. It's the deck that I personally did the best with. It's the deck that got me Legend. I ended up going 17-2 with it. It felt really, really good. The tempo you get is surprisingly solid. The stats on a lot of these minions are good, and you're able to just constantly generate more and more elementals to keep that chain going. And then you can play Scar whenever you want, really, and it can do 7 to sometimes even 17 damage. I did 17 damage with this guy in 1 turn because I just waited until the very end as like a burst to finish off my opponent. It was insane. I actually think this deck is quite good, but again, early on, maybe there are more value decks that come out, so craft that one at your caution again. And then the last one is going to be Highlander Druid. Now, I personally like a version with duplicates because this deck has so much draw that by the time you get to around turn 10, your Highlander will probably be active. Reno and Raystraza will probably be active. It's a little bit riskier, so if you want to run the normal Highlander version, I will also leave a link to that in the description. Also, there's one more deck on here. I think I said this was the last one. That's a lie. But overall, you have insane value. The Dragon Golem can get you so much value. You can fill your board with giant minions, especially if you pump them up with the Snapdragon Whelp or Take to the Skies. Obviously, Reno and Raystraza are good, but you also just have a lot of good statted dragons. Like, that's their thing, right? Dragons are a little bit slower. You don't really have like that many 1 or 2 drops, but once you get to that mid game around turn 4 and on, every single minion you put on the board is a threat with a pretty good ability. So you can build either this version, which I like. It gives you a bit more consistency with things like Dragon Golem and Reno and Raystraza that you have to play a little bit later, or you can play the Highlander version. I will leave that in the description. And the last one is going to be Ogre Rogue. I haven't played this one yet, but I've seen it played multiple times. I'm actually going to be playing it on stream today, so by the time you're watching this, maybe I have already played it, but it just looks amazing. Things like Shadow Step as well as Breakdance to bounce back to your hand a really sick win condition is just absurd. I hate Shadow Step, but my goodness is it good with certain battle cries. Like, you are able to just, you can literally fill a board with giant, good statted ogres. I want to say up to like 5 or 6 times. That's not even including maybe getting an extra copy of a spell off of Door of Shadows, getting an extra copy of a card off of Shadow of Demise, or being able to randomly generate something off of the Potion Belt, which could maybe give you another copy of Kingpin Pud as well. This deck is just so... It's really good. I don't know if it's quite as good as some of the other decks out there, but it is close. It is quite solid, and if you like the ogres, this is great. There's also an Ogre pre-stack. I have a video on that coming out soon. It's not quite as good as Ogre Rogue, but it has a little bit more control, so depending on the meta, it might also be good. But overall, these are the best decks in the game. I hope you all enjoyed. I did not include some decks on here like Warlock because I don't know how good it is going to be after the nerf, right? I don't know if the nerf to the snake is going to be enough to make this deck unplayable. It says 4 mana. It's actually 6 mana now. It's a server-side patch, so this is supposed to be 6. I don't know if the nerf is going to be big enough to kill the deck, or if the deck will just kind of shift around a little bit, you know, focus less on bouncing and focus more on maybe like a Thaddeus package. I don't know yet. I'm also not including decks that have been good for a while, like Mech Rogue and Pure Paladin, as well as Arcane Hunter to some extent. These just aggressive decks that, because they're really fast, will always have at least a pretty decent win rate, so I didn't include those as well. And last, this is across as much of a sample size as I possibly can, so basically Diamond through Legend. Yes, the meta might be a little bit different at High Legend, and the meta might be a little bit different in the lower ranks from like Bronze to Gold or Platinum, but these are the best decks in the largest sample size from both my own experience, things I've seen online. I just want to give you guys the most information possible. So if you made it this far, I really do appreciate it. I will see you guys in the next one. Have a good one, and maybe in the stream.